by those things and people and all the things in this material world that might cause us anguish. There's a difference that the scripture creates between your senses, your mind, and your intelligence. Focus is mindfulness. If you can go through all of life focusing on the inner witnessing or focusing just on things like mindfulness, which today translates to focusing on your breath or focusing on that one action that you're doing, you will be able to not get attached to the distractions of the world.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode here of Woven Wings Live. I'm joined here by Rahul Didwania, my co-host. I'm Gabe Crane, and we are excited to be with you here today for episode 9 of our show. And today's theme is one I'm particularly excited to be diving into today. Our theme is engaging sacred texts in the modern world, kind of taking learnings from different wisdom traditions or scriptures and being able to apply them into our daily and modern lives. We have a wonderful guest here today, Sampada Waklu, who is very engaged with an organization in India that works with the Bhagavad Gita. Today, we're going to be looking closely at that tradition as a way to explore this broader theme of sacred traditions in our lives. And so with that, I want to call in my partner here and buddy, Rahul. Rahul, thanks for making another episode of this show with me today. How's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for asking, Gabe, and excited to be here as always. And I know we've had a couple of different kinds of episodes recently, and so I'm also excited to get back to this flow that we've created for ourselves here.
It's nice to have a guest in the studio again, right? After the last couple of weeks off, we did a repost of our original episode with Rabbi Adina Allen, which also dealt with, to some extent, with sacred texts. And then last episode, I really enjoyed that episode with you, Rahul, but it was just the two of us talking about the Woven Wings Live process and how it's been over these first months of 2022. We're back with an expert in the room, thankfully, to keep us on track towards this topic. And so just on this topic, I guess I just really want to dive right in there and open this up. I'm excited for this topic because I think this is a point of interest and also tension for myself and so many people that I know, being interested in and drawing on the wisdom of sacred traditions, and at the same time being a modern person and being uncomfortable in certain ways, maybe with the way that those traditions have been traditionally applied or what the expectations might be for me because I'm interested in that topic, right? Things like that. And so I guess I'm curious, just to start out there, how has your own relationship been with maybe the Bhagavad Gita itself specifically, but just kind of with religious texts and traditions in general as you've grown up and kind of become the person you are today?
It's a great question. So for me, I grew up in a Hindu family, so very much, around the Vedic tradition, and was fortunate also to be introduced to Buddhism and little bits of Christianity and Islamic teachings just through this cultural school that I went to. But that was, I'd say more cursory and introductory. And so really, I think it was really the Vedic tradition that's been my strongest root as it relates to sacred texts and sort of a religious context that I came up in. And within that, it's been an interesting tension for me, throughout my life, but really thinking about growing up, I think there was always this unresolved tension between being taught rituals and mythology and it's called shlokas, basically chants and memorizing them versus actually cultivating understanding and cultivating curiosity and an attitude towards learning. I kind of liken it to, I think a lot of people, when they talk about learning history, they're like, oh yeah, we're not really that into learning dates and events. But as you grow older, you see history has a lot to learn from and provides this deep context for the present. And honestly, that's kind of how I feel about a lot of it now, which is hey, I've learned this mythology, I've learned these chants, these shlokas, but actually somewhere within that was also, a lot of wisdom, right? And a lot of just like a code. And I think as I've gotten older, I've now felt a curiosity towards actually learning that aspect of it and trying to be intentional about, visiting these traditions with that lens. And so that's just a little bit about, where I've been at. I'd be, yeah, curious to hear your reaction to that, Gabe, or even if you want to share your experience.
Well, I'll tie the two together because, when you're talking about kind of this rote memorization and learning those shlokas, it reminded me of my bar mitzvah training when I was 12, 13 years old, where we similarly were memorizing a segment of the Torah, which you recite, and that's kind of your big graduation, or this rite of passage. But similarly, I mean, we did learn about what it was saying and had to give a talk about it. But as a 13-year-old kid, I remember being similarly confused and a little bit disillusioned with the whole process. Like it just felt like I'm memorizing and repeating something that I don't really have a deep connection to. And even more than that, like the folks around me who are teaching it to me, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense at all to them, but I wasn't sure really what their connection was to it. I grew up in like a Reform American Jewish environment within this synagogue. And most people in that context, the culture, the social nature of the synagogue, those are probably like the most important things and the reasons why they were involved there and their family was involved. And the Torah itself, or like, the religious text and the tradition, that was seen with a degree of respect and reverence. But there's always this kind of like undercurrent running through that interaction of like, we don't take that so literally or seriously. As modern people, we're looking back on, the things that someone came up with in the desert that made sense for that time, but it doesn't necessarily make sense for now. And as a modern person, as someone who appreciates science and the scientific method and cultural diversity and, some of the benefits of a global world, even as there's obviously lots of challenges, I think that there's an important value there, right? That folks were kind of taking those traditions with a grain of salt or being able to filter it through some modern lens. But then at the same time, it felt like there's something that's lost. And you talked about this code or this wisdom that was within this scripture that you didn't have access to at that time. And I think it's similarly in my tradition. When I went to college and I started to have more of a awakening process, what they call it spiritual awakening or just personal development, I started to see things through a lens of meaningfulness. I started to see that, wow, there's this whole world that teaches about tolerance, about values, about love that is embedded into this thing that I was kind of dismissing or cultured to dismiss. I can really relate. And so it's interesting to me, it's like some two very different traditions, right? Your experience and mine, but they're kind of joined by the generational component, right? We're both around the same age and kind of grappling with engaging with these texts from that context, from the present moment in the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like another thing that comes to mind for me is like, I also remember, and this is true, I'd say even like after childhood a little bit, it's like, I feel like I always had a little bit of an interest in like going deeper. And I remember there was this lecture series by this, his name was Swami Mukhananand, and he was a teacher that just came through and did this like evening lecture at this local temple. And I remember going with my mom and with my grandma, and like we really enjoyed it. And it was like very eye opening for me because he was teaching this ancient wisdom, but very like deliberately doing so in not only like simple language, but like acknowledging the modern context, and I found that to be very exciting. And then later though, what I found is that, oh, like I actually don't know how to continue that exploration. And something like going in and reading the Ramayana or the Gita, or something in like detail. And okay, they might have like a English translation or like an English meaning section or something. Always felt like a little bit daunting. I was like, hey, am I ready to do that? between the length of the text and just my own maturity and ability to like internalize these things. And I think availability of like a community that was oriented around this. I think as a kid, you can still find that pretty easily, but afterwards, like college and post college, has not always been obvious to me. Right. And then beyond that, I think also there's this thing of like nobody or very few people that I know at our age are actually engaging with this. And so there's also this, I guess, invisible social pressure or dynamic that's kind of like not guiding me in that direction, or I guess like naturally creating a path in that direction. And yeah, it's almost like there have been moments where I feel almost like off, or like weird being like drawn to this stuff where I'm like, oh, like nobody else is really drawn to this. And that's just this whole other dynamic that's kind of coexisted, at least. And I've become more aware of it, I think, in recent years.
That really resonates. It puts me back when I was in my undergraduate degree. That's when I first kind of re-encountered sacred texts or got interested in reading the Bible. And it had kind of come out of some, I guess, spiritual experiences or meaningful experiences that I'd had being in the wilderness and on like a wilderness trip. And I think something about the extended period of time being outside of nature, not being on a phone. I mean, this is like a little while ago. People still had phones. It wasn't as of an addictive epidemic as it is now, but like just being in that space brought me in touch with something that felt very special and meaningful and profound to me. And I didn't really have too many frameworks for making sense of that. And I came back to school and I got interested in reading the Bible less from like so even as I'm saying it, I'm noticing, the challenges that you named, right? Because it's like the second that I say that, oh, I was interested in reading the Bible, it just sounds so off, at least for where I came from. Again, like growing up in kind of a largely secular, liberal, reform community, and having this interest in reading that, and then encountering all these kind of questions and discomforts. I remember going to like the campus Hillel and having Shabbat there, and which is like the Friday night, meal, and meeting some people and just feeling very uncomfortable and confused. Like, what am I doing here? Am I going to be converted? Am I becoming religious? Like sort of like these kinds of questions going through my head. And I can laugh about it now and kind of look back and appreciate it. But at the time, I remember feeling a lot of angst and fear really about like what was happening and if it was really okay or rational or reasonable to have an interest in this, right? And to feel that there might be something hidden in there that would be of value, right? That could bring some wisdom and insight into my life. I think that confrontation is very strong. I think that the assumption is that if you are interested in these sorts of texts, then you must therefore be really religious, or maybe that you're like kind of like a new ager or something, you're a little starry-eyed, or if you're not going to be religious, you'll be like giving tarot readings and reading palms before you know it or something like that. Just the subtle challenge of that really, really speaks to me.
One of the things I'm feeling gratitude for right now is specifically as it relates to the Gita, like I've been lucky both to have been exposed to it by the like leader of this cultural school that I went to, every couple of weeks growing up, but also the family that I married into, like my wife Kirti, her parents and their extended family are really into studying the Gita, like not just as like a religious text, but as a wisdom text, as we've been talking about it. And, just right now feeling fortunate to be part of that and to have that support. And then also kind of want to use this as an opportunity to begin to introduce our guest, who it's my honor to introduce Sampada Waklu, who's a dear friend and someone who's, really been an important character in my life and Kirti's life over the last couple of years, and also someone who really does create space for this kind of exploration. Sampada, has had a childhood spent in a lot of different places, ranging from New York here in the US to many parts of India, including Delhi and Kashmir and other parts of, the UP state, among others. And that's led her to have a really multicultural outlook on the world. And something that I really appreciate is her orientation towards cultivating harmony and connection and understanding. She lives here, in the San Francisco Bay Area, not too far from me, works at a startup called Handshake that's oriented towards democratizing opportunity for early talent. But in addition to that, also, has a number of side projects that are really coming from that place of cultivating harmony and understanding and connection. And one of those is related to the Gita, where Sampada has grown up around the Vedic tradition and around that scripture, but recently, felt a deepened sense of commitment to that. And that led her to serve as a host of this global Bhagavad Gita Convention just in February of this year, and it was focused on the theme of mental harmony. And her specific role was really oriented also on finding ways to bridge the gap from these sacred texts and the wisdom there to the modern context and to the modern and younger audience as well. With that, I want to invite Sampada to come in and say hello to our listeners. Once again, it's an honor to have you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Rahul, for that wonderful introduction. And it's such an honor to be on this podcast with you and with Gabe. I couldn't think of a better podcast to make my debut. And what better way to talk about something as deep and as profound and as relevant as really understanding intentional living through the sacred text. So thank you so much for having me.
I'd love to start out just by laying a little bit of groundwork. And so first off, we'd love if you could just share a little bit about the Global Gita organization and what it's all about.
As you mentioned, Rahul, in my introduction, I had the fortune of hosting the Global Bhagavad Gita Convention in Feb of this year. The Global Bhagavad Gita Convention this is the 5th year that they conducted this, and it's hosted under the inspiration and the guidance of a Swami that lives in India, in Kerala. And his name is Swami Bhumananda Tirtha. And he actually has been the guru or the spiritual guide, teacher for my parents. And so he has been associated with our family for more than 25 years. And so he's kind of always been in the periphery of my life. But it was through kind of my research and my deepened sort of sense of curiosity and commitment to really trying to understand mental harmony and really the learnings that come from the scriptures so that I could really selfishly use them for my own life coming out of the pandemic. It was that really took me deeper into rekindling my relationship with the ashram, with Swamiji, and through conversation and through a deepened sense of understanding, it was that then I was presented the opportunity to host this convention. And the larger message was mental harmony, but as you rightly mentioned, connecting that back to the audience that is this Gen Z, where we are on our phones and we are moving at 1,000,000 miles per minute, but have to find ways to make this attractive, accessible. And so that really was the intention, and it was hosted with the inspiration of Swamiji.
Interesting to hear about all of that, Sampada. Thanks for sharing. I guess, again, with this kind of laying the foundation, I'm curious for folks who aren't as familiar or familiar at all with the Bhagavad Gita, can you share with us, obviously this is a huge topic, but in a soundbite, right? Or in like a short summary, what is the Gita about for those that are unfamiliar? What's just a brief summary of the story and the type of wisdom that comes from the Gita?
Absolutely. The spark notes of the Bhagavad Gita, if you may. So the Bhagavad Gita actually, Gabe, for our listeners that may not be familiar with it, is an episode that comes from the larger text, which is called the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is one of 2 epics that India is famous for, one being the Ramayana and one being the Mahabharata. For many of the folks on the call who may have grown up reading the Iliad or the Odyssey, something that's really fascinating is that the Mahabharata is actually made up of about 100,000 couplets. It's one of the most incredible poems and epics to be created. And that's about 7 or 8 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. So it truly is one of the most incredible stories out there, but it really is a historical narration. And the Bhagavad Gita comes from this larger epic tale of the Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita specifically is a dialogue. It takes place on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, and it's a conversation that happens between Prince Arjuna, who is the greatest warrior of his time, and Krishna, who is the avatar of the Hindu deity Vishnu, who really serves as his charioteer, but also his spiritual teacher in the moment. And so this whole conversation, and truly it is a conversation, which is one of the elements that drew me to the story of the Bhagavad Gita, but this is truly a conversation that takes place on the battlefield with a warrior who is really kind of succumbed to the internal doubt that he feels in the moment, and the conversation then ensues. So that is the Bhagavad Gita, and really where a lot of the awesome concepts that I think we can talk about today and start to think about over the next couple of years as our own spiritual journeys continue, that's where that comes from.
Thank you for that overview, Sampada. And I'm curious, this might be a tough question, but I'm curious if you could characterize the type of wisdom that comes from that dialogue. I know a lot of people focus on different things, and again, that wisdom is very vast. But if there was a way to characterize that, I'm curious what comes to you there.
Oof, that is a tall order, Rahul. I'm not Swami Sampada just yet, but I will try. I guess to share with our listeners a little bit more context, just to place into the larger scene here, what the main concepts of the Bhagavad Gita are, and they truly are a lot of things that take time and persistence to figure out and really digest. But what's happening is that Arjuna, who I mentioned, is the warrior. He is truly the best of his kind. He is an incredible fighter, incredible warrior. But he is going to war with another part of his family. This is between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, which are two parts of the same family. They're connected by two brothers. And so the reason that Arjuna faces this crippling sense of doubt and anxiety and sadness is because he sees the other side and sees Bhisma, who is the great-grandfather of the family, and Drona, who is the teacher, who taught him how to fight. And so unlike any other war that Arjuna has had to fight in the past, where he has seen his enemies as enemies, for the first time in his life, he sees the other side and is unable to forget that this is, in fact, his kin, his family, his teachers. And so he falls truly moments before the war is to begin. And he falls and succumbs into his chariot and is weeping. And in today's context, this would be an emotional breakdown, something where you are truly giving into the anxiety and the sadness that you feel. So I share that context because a lot of the concepts that the Bhagavad Gita is then sharing with us as a reader comes from this place of trying to understand, why is it that we feel this crippling sense of self-doubt? How do we think about responsibility and duty? How do we think about our actions when it comes to outcomes, and even if that outcome is to cause pain? And so it's truly a very remarkable conversation. And one of the things that I often get asked at this point is, if this is happening on a battlefield, if this is about a warrior, how is it then that this is applicable to us? Immediately, I'm checked out because I'm working at a tech startup, and you know what? This is actually really isn't this isn't relatable. But the beauty about this is that, one, all of life is interactional. And so that is the that is the fact that is not changing, regardless of what the actual material manifestation is. It could be a tech startup, it could be running a podcast and being in the studio every single day, or it could be being a warrior who needs to go to battle. And so that element is truly the fundamental aspect of the Gita, and that's where a lot of the learning comes from.
I'm curious, Sampada, with all of that, could you take us into how maybe a personal slice of how that has been personally meaningful or affected you? That's one way of say, what was it that personally compelled you and made you feel that this story with its insights has personal significance for me, and it's something that matters to me so much that I want to work on it, and be emissary of it in some form in the world?
I appreciate that question, Gabe. I'll be honest with you. I think some things over the past few years have serendipitously fallen in my lap. I think there's one part of it which has been setting the intention and committing from a time and mind space perspective in pursuing certain ideas and being curious. But I will say that certain opportunities have come just as a result of some of those interactions. But that said, I think the reason I was really drawn to the Bhagavad Gita specifically is because of some of the reasons that Gabe, you mentioned at the very top of the podcast today, and Rahul did as well, which is number one, it can seem a little daunting when you're reading these texts or scriptures from any religion. And one of the things that the Bhagavad Gita had, it had these two characters. It had Arjuna and it had Krishna. And so inherently the dialogue is truly an inquiry. And so the reason I was drawn to this text is because in my mind, Arjuna is me. He's asking the questions that I, as a critical thinker, as I'm looking at religion or the life lessons that you must live by, the questions that I'm asking. And so I really enjoyed this text because it showed us both sides. And every single time that I've gone back to the Gita, I feel like I understand another layer of what Krishna is trying to say. But Arjuna is asking Krishna for guidance, and he's asking for clarity. And I felt like I resonated very deeply with him. And so to answer your question, Gabe, I think it was that dialogue element and the fact that this truly is 18 chapters of inquiry that made me feel very connected to the questioning aspect and made me feel like this was a less daunting text to start my own journey into the larger world of scriptures.
It connects me with this idea of mentorship, that all of us go through a process of growing up, encountering different experiences and having questions, right? And not being so sure where to look for the answer to those questions. I guess these days, we've got a little sub theme around technology and social media running on this show. It's like, I guess we like pop those questions out into the ether or like post it on Facebook or Twitter or something, but it sounds like, wisdom can come back that way, and a lot of other things can come back too. It sounds like this for you was a process of getting some insight and answers to some of the most meaningful questions that you were asking in your life. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I'll be honest with you. I think when I first started reading it, I said, wait, Arjuna is totally right. I don't get why there's a problem with his way of thinking. He's saying he doesn't want to hurt the people that have taught him and loved him. And I don't see anything wrong with that. And that's truly chapter one. Chapter one is just setting that context, and Arjuna is sharing all these thoughts that are going through his mind. And as I've gone back to the text, I have better understood what Krishna is trying to help Arjuna understand, that there is a difference between the soul and the matter. And I think a lot of the point that you made at the top of the hour, Gabe, is that, you often have teachers who may not fully understand or grasp a certain scripture or text either. Every time I've gone back, I've tried to really fully understand. It's a book that I think takes many readings. But when I read that, resonated with this feeling that I've had for many years now, where the sense that when you were walking in the woods, Gabe, you said that was something special. And I knew that there was something there. And that's something that I too have experienced in the past, but have never known how quite to articulate or differentiate that from me, the identity of myself. And so when I read this, that there's a difference, there's a universal oneness, but there's a difference between soul and matter, that there's something inside you that continues to live on despite the physical body that you may inhabit today. That felt like I've been thinking this for so long, but I had never read it or understood it. I felt like I was hooked. And I've been going back to the text in a few different ways ever since.
There's both a thoughtfulness and diligence, I think, to the way you're describing your process and your engagement with this, with spiritual growth and with learning. I kind of want to use that as an opportunity to open up to the larger topic, which is, like, how do we as modern people living in 2022, relate to these ideas, and how can we reconcile our lifestyle today with this process of spiritual growth?
I was thinking about this, and I have been very transparently for the last few months, ever since, in preparation for the Global Gita Convention and for time after that as well. There's no easy answer. There's no silver bullet answer, just given that so much of our generation is told to do things that are truly counterintuitive to the learnings of our ancestors and the ancient scriptures. We are fed and we are told to run 1,000,000 miles per minute. We are told that the hustle don't stop. We are told to be productive. Constantly, I think our mind and our mind space is occupied with material things and multitasking and being productive, understandably, with no fault of our own. But the first step that I think needs to happen is there needs to be an understanding and awareness of the fact that this may not be the way of life that creates the foundation for intentional living long term. And I think it starts there because unlike, you could, this is comparable to maybe a fitness routine that you do for your physical body. Even if you start to do the Peloton today, you're not really going to stick with it unless you fully understand the long term benefits of making healthy decisions or healthy habits. And so I think the first step for all of our listeners, including the three of us here, is trying to first understand what you are trying to go for and truly what basic things need to happen in order to ensure that you're living a peaceful and emotionally tranquil life.
Absolutely does. And I think this is just the spot to kind of dive in deeper and really try to understand this a little more.
Mm-hmm.
So if I imagine, what I hear in what you're saying is that ultimately, yes, and maybe we'll talk about this in a minute around maybe some benefits of modern life and the modern approach to things.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like there's also a confrontation to that at least the Gita brings, which is that, hey, the foundations, if you think your life is about productivity and rushing and kind of accomplishment in that sense, you're setting things up on a shaky foundation. History shows, human life experience shows that is not the way to attain success or find a sense of happiness in the world. Is that correct?
I will say the only thing I would challenge, Gabe, is that the last thing you mentioned, which is those people may not be able to find happiness. They actually may be completely blissful in their ignorance of living a certain life. And that's completely okay. I think that there's value in understanding that once you have put in the work to better understand concepts like universal oneness or understanding that there's a difference between your identity and your inner self, the I that sits within you, and we can talk about that as well as doing things for excellence but not for outcomes. There's a fundamental shift that does happen in your own emotional state as you traverse through the interactional relationships and through interactions through the rest of your life. What we're trying to get at is this level-headedness that I think we often forget about when we're feeling super happy or super excited, but then we think about when we're feeling sad or angry. The idea is to have this like even balance through our lives that allows us to be fully ourselves while at the same time truly being a little bit detached from all the things that are happening around us that are not in our control.
So if you were to imagine like someone that's not already steeped in that kind of thinking, right? Like maybe someone that's very new to this world and maybe not bought in, right, to this idea that, hey, that's what I want to, that's like the place to be, right? Is in a state of level headedness, a state of detachment, of inner peace, or whatever it might be. How do you like bring that person in, right? Or how do you make this spiritual growth process, because it is a process, right? Not just a momentary learning. It's like, how do you make it attractive to them?
Well, I think that one of the things that, and this happens organically with many of my dear friends and close family, oftentimes, and I'm sure Gabe with you and with Rahul as well, people that you speak to may call you up and say, I can't believe this person said this thing to me, or oh, I can't imagine that she did that, or just interactional things that cause an individual to feel some type of way. And oftentimes those occasions, interactions, are a good time for me to remind the person to say, hey, that person's actions are not in your control. This is a great time for you to reflect on the fact that at the end of the day, all you can control is yourself and your own emotions. And so at that moment, they're like, I guess that makes sense. And the reason I share an example like that is because it's moments like that where that actually makes a difference. Because I think, Gabe, to your point from earlier, we're kind of already in this loop of constantly doing something, that even the act of stopping and pausing to reflect, it takes true intention. And so, Rahul, to your question, what I don't start by making it attractive and talking about it out of the blue, but I do seize these opportunities where people in my own life may be kind of suffering emotionally because of not recognizing some of these fundamental concepts. And I use that time to share with them the other side and share with them a glimpse of how, with a lot of work and patience and persistence, there is this future where we can actively be, kind of unaffected by those things and people, and all the things in this material world that might cause us anguish. One of the things that I'll share with you that resonates from the Gita as well is there's a difference that the scripture creates between your senses, your mind, and your intelligence. And the intelligence is kind of that really magical spirit or soul, and it takes a different name depending on the religion or the sphere of the world that you're in. But that's the intelligence is really the thing that is above all understanding yourself. But it is the senses with which you actually engage with the world. And the trouble or the emotional anxiety or the pain that we feel as human beings on this planet happens from the senses to the mind. It's how you engage with the world, your interactions with those around you, or even the things in this material world, that then as you're consuming and it goes to your mind, that's where you have sukha and dukkha, which is the pleasant association or the unpleasant association. So if you are able to be cognizant as you're having these interactions with that world, and if it creates an unpleasant feeling in your mind, if you are able to be aware of that, that is step one. That awareness is step one. Because before you do anything, whether it be meditation or yoga or, attend the Global Gita Convention every year, which I highly encourage you to do, it is those moments of awareness that create the most difference. And that has been, Rahul, to answer your question, the avenue through which I've tried to make this more accessible and understandable for those around me.
A great example, Sampada. Thanks for giving that. And what it underscored for me is this dynamic of emotional reactivity and the experience of emotions that we have. And
Mm-hmm.
I was curious, going back to something you had mentioned before around sometimes people are just kind of blissfully unaware and they go along and that's fine. It seems to me like that might be fine in like kind of the bubble in which that experience is happening, but without this underlying awareness of kind of the way this process works as you're describing it, it puts us at risk of emotional reactivity because we don't have that awareness. That makes it more likely that we'll bump into other people who are also experiencing emotional reactivity in an unconscious way. And then that things can kind of escalate from there or go in a number of different directions. And I'm thinking about kind of the echo chambers that are created within our technologies these days and our social media that leads us to, if we just take it literally on that surface level, it kind of validates emotional outrage and different feelings that come up for people. And I guess I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to this of the value of being able to step back as you're describing and perceive the good and the bad, as you said, that are coming in, and having a little bit more space from that experience rather than being wrapped up immediately into a response.
Gabe, I think you articulated that so well. I loved the concept of the echo chambers because that truly is exactly what happens, and the emotional reactivity. If you live your life unaware, blissfully unaware, then you think that that's how you are to operate. Rahul had mentioned something that I resonate with deeply at the very beginning, which is that, sometimes you are then engaging with other people and you see that they're emotionally reacting a certain way, but you're realizing you're wired a little bit differently. But we feel a little bit lonely, or we feel like, oh, why isn't anyone else thinking about responding or internalizing some of the things that are happening? So to your point, Gabe, I think that unfortunately, we've built this culture of not taking a second to respond, and we have over indexed on the react. And there's a massive difference. Forget the external implication, which is, of course, we're building a more harmonious world, and that we are trying to see the other person's side, or that we're trying to operate with compassion and love. But even the internal implication is massive. Emotional reactivity isn't good for your own body, heart, mind, soul, however you want to describe that. And so living a life where you're constantly, at the verge of agitation isn't the way to live. And so, to Gabe, to your point, I think this larger conversation isn't just good at the individual level. It's absolutely good at the individual level, but it also is really important if we're trying to build societies and communities that are harmonious, that are leading with empathy and compassion. And that is the difference in just this simple thing as pausing, reflecting, and thinking about your interaction, being intentional with your words, your actions, and seeing where that comes from. We're in a tricky situation right now, I think, as a global community. And I think social media hasn't helped, but I think that we have almost given everyone a platform to air out agitations and emotional reactions, Gabe, kind of to what you were mentioning, that I think is aggravating or stirring the pot in this case, taking us further away from the hopeful future of being a little bit more connected and harmonious with each other. Is that something that you're recognizing as well in just social technology and its implication from some of the other conversations you've had?
It is. And I think what your response brought forward for me is that aspect of modern life, which is kind of, we have everything on demand. It's kind of, if obviously not everyone does, but we have huge segments of the population that have access to, click a button and order it, and it arrives on your doorstep in 2 days, or I want this, so I go out and I get it. And the story that you framed of Arjuna, like exquisite anguish, it sounds to me like it's an inescapable position. He has a sacred duty that he has to carry out, and he can't like check out and go order like a pizza from Domino's and like be like, I'm done. Like, I don't want to be part of that. He is kind of called to grapple with this particular situation he's got, which seems like it's kind of a broader metaphor for life, and Rahul, I'm thinking about our interaction with Brian Wheeler in episode 6, this being stuck in the tension between two poles, being trapped. Maybe that's how Arjuna sounds like he feels at the beginning of the story, feeling trapped in this sense of kind of paradox, or how could I go to battle with my family or the people who have taught me, but that there is a inner wisdom, there are reasons that become apparent through the interiority, right? Through him having to stand still there and hear the responses from Krishna. That seems to me, I guess that's my 2 cents on it. It seems like that is what is lost often these days, and when we have more of a culture of instant gratification.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, even as I was thinking and gathering my thoughts for today's conversation with both of you, I was thinking a little bit more about the idea of instant validation or gratification as a young audience that we typically are always thinking about, whether it be social media or even, the articles that you see out there, from a fitness routine to lose weight and to do this. And so, unfortunately, in the disclaimer, I think that is important to share is that spiritual practice and work takes time. And really, the results are when you are able to be in a situation that might be otherwise tough or emotionally sort of tumultuous. It's in that moment when you recognize that you're able to take that step back or just be a witness to what is happening around you. There's this idea in the Bhagavad Gita that is, there is an I. We say, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. The I is not changing. There's a awareness that is constantly there as you're going through the tasks of your life. And there's the idea of witnessing what you're going through without getting into the deep end of connection, attachment, despair, anger, or even true joyous, like elated happiness, all of those things are actually a result or a reaction. And if you're able to just witness the things that are happening around you, kind of as Arjuna is able to achieve at the end of the Bhagavad Gita, that is when you're able to actually go through the motions of life, but do so in a way that you are truly free, and in a way that you're able to live in a way that is authentic, freeing, and gives you the most emotional tranquility. And I think one of the things that Rahul, you mentioned is there was a teacher when you were younger, a Swamiji, who had come and kind of distilled these learnings for you. And in the book with Arjuna and Krishna, Krishna is that coach. He is that life coach. He is that guide or the teacher who's kind of helping Arjun make that path for himself. And I think that part is missing because today there's a lot of stigma around scriptures and things, that tools that might help us, because I think they get immediately connected to religion. But if you're able to actually make that distinction between the two and couple that with your own critical thinking ability, there's a lot of room for growth and understanding. And I think the last point here is that, the Gita has a lot of different concepts. And the idea isn't for you to take all of them, but it's to take what resonates and to start somewhere with the work that you do on your own mind and intelligence.
Yeah, so a lot of what you were just speaking to there, I think, was around this process, right, of spiritual growth, and what you said there around like it's work, right? It takes attention, it takes energy, and it benefits from having guidance. And so I really want to hone in on that for a second. So I think 2 points really come to mind. One is this idea of like, how do we create the space for ourselves to engage in that spiritual growth process, right? Like I know there's this concept of sannyasa, which is like, forget the modern context of all the distractions and all the instant gratification and all that. I mean, even back in the day, these like spiritual gurus, as part of their enlightenment process and self-actualization process, actively remove themselves, right, from the hustle and bustle of whatever the material world was in their time. And this idea of just like, hey, there is something powerful, right, with removing all these distractions, turning off all the junk, so to speak, and immersing in that kind of an experience. And so question number one is like, can that be substituted with something else? Or is it necessary to create that kind of space to really engage in a meaningful growth process?
I love that question, Rahul, because I also, as a child, I mentioned earlier that my parents have had Swami Bhumananda Tirtha, who has been their spiritual master. But much like the both of you who grew up in certain households, I think when you are told to do something as a child, you want to take a step back. And so I didn't want to engage very deeply. I, of course, would go to certain discourses and conversations. But as an adult, I've kind of found my way back, funnily enough, back to the ashram. But the beauty about the spiritual process is that it can be however you choose for it to be. And it can be whatever best aligns with your predisposition as a human being. And so you, Rahul, to your question, you do not have to renounce everything in the world and go to the mountains of the Himalayas and meditate for 30 years. No, absolutely not. You can actually bring the same level of awareness and that element of witnessing and truly just mindfulness to whatever actions you are doing day in and day out. But there's an incredible story back home of a king who was known to be quite spiritually enlightened. And there was a lot of sort of skepticism in the larger group of disciples, because it's like, how can a king who has all these material things and is constantly making these decisions that are so tactical in the day in and day out, how can this person be truly spiritual? How can they be mindful? And one of the disciples wanted to kind of suss out this king. And he goes to the king and says, hey, I'm here, I'm a disciple, and I just want to spend some time in better understanding your spiritual practice. The king goes, that's fine, I'm happy to help. But the first things first, tomorrow there's a massive mela. A mela is a Hindi word for a carnival in the city. And I want you to carry a pot of milk on your head for the entirety of the carnival. If you're not able to do so, if you drop even one droplet of milk to the ground, I'm going to behead you. And he goes, what? I just got here. King, please, have mercy. And the king says, nope, we'll only talk once you come back. So this guy has the pot of milk on his head, and he spends the day going through the crevices of the carnival from the point A to point B, and finally makes it back to the kingdom and the palace, having not dropped one pot of milk that he carried on his head. And so the king, once he sees him in the evening, says, hey, did you enjoy the circus? Did you enjoy the joker that was there? Did you enjoy the elephant? And this guy said, I didn't notice a thing. I was so caught up in just making sure none of the milk fell. And the king responded back saying, that focus is mindfulness. If you can go through all of life focusing on the inner witnessing, or focusing just on things like mindfulness, which today translates to focusing on your breath or focusing on that one action that you're doing, you will be able to not get attached to the distractions of the world. And so I share this partly hilarious story because there's no one right way to be someone who is going through a spiritual journey. If the king who is making decisions around finances and politics every single day is able to really find that balance, many of us today who have probably lesser distractions, but probably things that occupy more of our mind, I think we can do it too.
I'd love to jump in there. Rahul, was there a second part to your question?
Just throw that second part in. Yeah. First off, thank you for that story. I think I'm gonna.
It's a story that's always stuck with me. And I just find I've obviously forgotten a few of the names, but I've always loved the idea of the carnival. And he had to walk through the carnival and he was so caught up in just the milk. That is the funny kind of visual as we think through going through the motions of this life. And so thank you for humoring me, both of you, in listening to that story.
Oh, that was great. I was so nervous for the guy. I thought your head's going to get chopped off.
Yeah.
Where does this story go? We don't know.
Yeah. So the second part was, what I picked up from that is like, hey, the environment might influence your degree of difficulty, so to speak, but hey, ultimately it's in your control, right? And you do have the ability to engage in this growth process regardless, of what your environment is, and kind of you can choose. And then so the second piece was around, you were saying with like Arjuna had Krishna, right, in the chariot, his guide, his teacher. The second part to me is like, okay, we can do this anywhere, but how do we supplement that, right? Like we don't all have Krishna in our corner. Like how do we emulate that for ourselves?
Yeah, and I think this is, kind of exactly what spurred my involvement with the Global Bhagavad Gita Convention, because one of the things that I found to be very, very critical in going through this journey is someone to be able to brainstorm or critically think alongside, and someone who is able to give you their perspective and how they are internalizing the learnings of the Gita or any other scripture for that matter. My involvement with the convention came in the attempt to build and connect with the community, not only of people my age, but people who may have started years ago in the same adventure and journey of trying to learn more and trying to connect with oneself. I was able to find that with the Global Gita Convention, and I was able to also continue working with the CIRD, which is Center of Inner Resources Development, that actually organized the event. I was able to work with them to also kickstart kind of a youth-led initiative, which is a workshop or just a conversation that happens once every quarter for anyone who wants to be a part of it. Maybe they want to listen in, maybe they want to attend and share all of their thoughts, but it is truly an attempt to build a community that allows you to think and push yourself spiritually, much like any other muscle in our body, really practicing to get this right and keeping each other accountable as we think through going through some of the motions of life. So I think for me, my ask to those who are listening and who are eager to get started or equally interested in finding that is trying to look out to find a community, a very small, one or two people to start, who can go on this journey with you, who are potentially in different parts of their journey spiritually, or maybe you're bringing them along. But I think creating a community where you can have this conversation, because I think our generation is all about that connection element, that back and forth dialogue. And we're able to kind of, when we have people who are socially engaged with us alongside us, I think that we just enjoy the process a lot more. So nothing stops us from doing that for our spiritual journey as well.
That's so great. I love that you brought up this notion of support, and it really dovetails, it seems to me, with what you had been describing earlier, Sampada, about life being inherently interactional, or based on this interaction that we see in the structure of the Gita. I hear that in the support dynamic, right? Is that when we find others that we can dialogue with and talk to about our experiences, then something begins to come to life a little bit more. And I think that's very much what we are in service of, I think, on Woven Wings Live, is promoting a global dialogue around spiritual traditions and intentional living, healthy living. And I guess, having gone through a few turns of that myself, bringing myself to the conversation, I'm curious, how can people feel comfortable being themselves as they come into that conversation? I'm thinking back to, some of those anecdotes I shared from earlier in my life where, I would step into a space. It's like, okay, I've agreed to talk about the Gita with somebody, or go to Shabbat dinner and like talk about the Torah portion from that week. I'm instantly uncomfortable because I feel like I'm in an environment that I don't totally know. And I feel like there might be an agenda at hand, or I might be asked to like check my beliefs or like my rational, modern, scientific approach to life. Or you mentioned critical thinking, right? Like that I won't necessarily be encouraged to think critically, or will actually be required to like suspend aspects of that, which are kind of maybe core to my identity as a contemporary person. Can you comment on some of those, or help allay some of those fears that people might have? It's like, how can people be themselves in this conversation, and how can they bring whatever the benefits of contemporary life or into this interaction so that it's actually personally fruitful for them, and doesn't kind of take them off into space that isn't really as resonant?
I think that the accountability falls on both the individual that is trying to connect, but also the others in that same space. I don't think that it falls only on one individual to, create that space. I think it's important that everyone who is either using a forum, or even, today's podcast is a wonderful example where there is an intention and a space, of a safe space that allows everyone to be vulnerable without judgment. I think that ground rule and that expectation setting is important, especially when you're trying to do some really important work as it pertains to your heart and your mind and your body. And so I think that I would encourage those who are seeking this out to do a little bit of the work to figure out if those in the other, in the group or the forum, align with that expectation. And I think it's a matter of finding a safe space, importance on the safe word, where you are allowed to be fully yourself. The one other thing that I'll mention is I would encourage everyone to also complement these social structures of support with small things that they can do to build mindfulness on that individual level. So I think it takes work to connect with those around you and really kind of help get started. But once you have embarked on that journey, in my opinion, it must be complemented with additional work that you're doing on yourself. But I think, Gabe, to your point, I encourage everyone to seek out connections that resonate and align with their own expectations as they're navigating through this process. Gabe, as you've gotten through this process as well yourself, what have been some things you've leveraged? I'm equally curious, as I'm sure the listeners on this call are.
I think I really appreciate what you shared there around creating that safety, and then that sense of it's okay to be yourself. I think sometimes when we look at traditional texts, it's almost like we expect to, or feel obligated to, kind of go back in time to like how things were then, and really helped me in terms of what you shared was thinking, okay, like I can be myself as I am today with all the different associated things that go along with that. And I can derive meaning from this process. I can get something that's genuinely helpful to me now, that helps me in my tangible, actual goals and needs of now, of the moment. And I might, through like the engagement process you're describing, I might have to confront things or learn about myself or about the world in ways that surprise me, or that were I didn't expect, or maybe are uncomfortable in some way. But I don't have to sign up for a religion or join a
No,
cult or be
absolutely.
in some group, like I think those are so often the fears that arise. And so I really appreciate what you shared around this, like the normalizing of that. Really, I mean, we're all thinking about these things in different ways, right? And there's different
And
ways to access this wisdom.
absolutely. And I mean, even today's conversation is exactly the type of space I'm hoping our listeners can create. Not everyone has to be of a certain religion or a certain background. In fact, it's conversations like this where you recognize how much we all have in common. And so I think I encourage exactly what you mentioned, Gabe. And I think I do not, in my time that I've been studying the Gita, I don't actually see the Gita as a religious text at all. I see it as a guidebook that helps me better understand how to live my life in a way that is intentional and really supplements my goal of emotional tranquility. I do not see this as a guidebook. I haven't supplemented this very transparently with going to temple or doing yoga with shlokas. No, I haven't. And so for me, again, no shame to anyone who needs to supplement any of their internal sort of processes with anything outside of the scripture. But I think for me that has been something that I kind of addressed at the very beginning of my journey with the Gita, because and even in the convention and some of the workshops that we're hosting, we really haven't talked about Hinduism. We've been talking about, let's talk about this one shloka which talks about anger, and let's talk about this one shloka that talks about how can we as ambitious young professionals think about doing things and taking action without being attached to the outcome. So it's really about bringing practicality to some of these guide shlokas in the book. But I just wanted to clarify that as well, because I think there is definitely a stigma as we think about these scriptures. And I want to just help sort of just change the notion as we think about taking what works for us from a million different sources. It could be the Bible. Some things resonate with the Bible, some things resonate in the Torah, some things resonate in the Gita. Take what you need, leave the rest, and build your own manuscript as you think about your spiritual journey. And that is one that is truly authentic to yourself.
So beautifully said. And all of this conversation is really taking me to this, like, this concept in like Buddhism, right? Of Dhamma, Buddha, Sangha, right? With Dhamma being capital T truth, or like knowledge that you gain through study, through time, through commitment and putting energy in. Buddha being that like mentor, right? Or that guru, and that can be multiple people, multiple sources. And then Sangha being like the community, right? Community of people that are learning, and the group energy. And I feel like those are the elements that we've been talking about here. And yeah, really, I think just in this moment, I can say for myself, like really feeling an energy and an excitement and a motivation to continue to invest in this journey, both for myself and in whatever way possible, trying to create that space and that intentionality for other people as well.
This has been such a rich conversation, and I'm keeping track of the time too. And I feel like, Sampada, we're going to have you back on here or something for a part 2, or even like 3 or 4.
I'll get more
There's just,
stories ready.
yeah. I mean, no, it's just been very, very rich. And I really want to just thank you again for coming on the show with us today, and just your embodiment of the deep knowledge you have of the text, the guidebook, so to speak, but your very relatable and human way of sharing that, I think, is just a really helpful example for all of us, and for our listeners, and for Rahul and I. So thank you so much for joining us today, and all the work that you're engaged in on this topic.
Thank you. No, Gabe, Rahul, thank you so much. I feel so grateful to have been part of this conversation. And, the one thing I'll leave our listeners with is that remind yourself that everyone is a work in progress. Take the time to recognize where you are and move forward from there and take a step forward, but recognize that also everyone around you has work to do. A big, big thank you to everyone listening, and a massive thank you to you, Rahul and Gabe, for having me on the podcast today.
I love that as like a closing point. And, some of that one thing Gabe and I often talk about is that this podcast has been a spiritual practice for us, and I think being reminded of and connecting to points like the one that you just made are part of that growth process, that we're engaged with as well. So, yeah, I think with that, Gabe, I don't know if you have anything from your end, but maybe we wrap it up here.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're at home listening, I hope that you gained a lot of interesting insights and values from our conversation today. We will be putting some information about how to find out more about Sampada's work in the episode description. So be sure to check that out. And I meant to mention this at the start of the show, but we went through a cycle of initial recordings, and Rahul and I are thinking about this as the start of a new cycle after we did our reflection piece with the two of us last episode. And so we're excited to be embarking on that journey with you. And as part of that, if you are interested and feel so inclined, we would love if you would leave us some feedback. So wherever you listen to podcasts, you could share feedback to us at live@wovenwings.net. That's also in the episode description. And please share with your friends or community, anyone you think might benefit from this conversation and being part of it. We are interested in seeding this conversation and these conversations in the world. So please do that. And if you feel so inspired to leave us a review on any of these sites, on Apple Podcasts, or give us a rating on Spotify or wherever you listen, we will be very appreciative as we continue to grow this work. With that, I want to say thank you again so much, Sampada. It's been a real pleasure. And we will catch you next time for episode 10. Take care and have a great couple weeks.